Prepare for a rude awakening.
Shalom, this is Michael Rood in Jerusalem, and I am standing in front of a Tammuz cave at the time of the winter solstice. This marker stone in front of the cave faces dead east and is replete with the Babylonian Tau that has been the iconographic representation of the Babylonian sun god who was born on December 25th, the ancient calendar, the winter solstice. This Babylonian Tau then turned into the Roman cross upon which the Romans sacrificed their victims, including Yeshua, as a sacrifice to their gods. The four Gospels paint a detailed portrait of the Messiah as he moves through the landscape that was painted by Moses and the prophets. If we do not understand the Torah, the Almighty's instructions through his prophet Moses, there is little chance that we can understand the life, work, and teachings of the Messiah. We need the background of the Torah, and especially the Feast of the Lord, if we are to understand the Gospels with any depth or clarity. The Feast of the Lord are the prophetic shadow pictures by which the Almighty told us the end of time from the very beginning. If we do not understand the Feast of the Lord and the biblical calendar, we can neither harmonize the Gospels or accurately reconstruct the chronology of the Gospels with any amount of precision. The Almighty did not haphazardly reveal his instructions to undisciplined, unreliable, spiritual basket cases with emotional problems. Neither did the prophets of the Almighty pick and choose which sentences out of the Torah made them feel good about themselves and then ignore the rest of the scriptures. Every word of Scripture is God-breathed and is profitable for teaching us how we should conduct our lives, for reproving us when we are out of alignment with the will of our Creator, and for correcting us and helping us to get our feet set in the right direction. Every single word is important, but every word must be kept in context, or any word can be distorted to prove whatever deviant behavior one desires to indulge himself in. The goal of the Scriptures is that the child of the Most High may achieve maturity in his relationship with his Creator and with his fellow man, and that every individual will be fully equipped for the voyage of life, whatever evil or good winds may blow. Yeshua never promised us a rosy path. On the contrary, he called us out of the world's religious systems and away from man-made commandments to walk the narrow path of obedience to the commandments of the Almighty. It was in the Galilee region that Yeshua found his greatest following, and it was there that he spent the majority of his ministry days. Capernaum was his home base, and it was from there that he traveled and taught throughout the region. He often returned to the Capernaum synagogue to teach, and it was there that he taught on the fulfillment of Hoshana Rabbah, the last great day. Now, the conclusion of the last great day and the resurrection. Now we're going to come to the very time in which we have left the feast of Shavuot. We have had the entire summer. Now we're coming up at the end of the year, and we have all during that summer, he has sent the 12 out, and he is out there teaching. Thousands of people are now following him. He goes across this lake to the other side, and there it is. Thousands of people are there together. They have had nothing to eat. He had compassion on them, realizing that, for all these people to get fed, he's responsible. He's got to do something about it. And so he has his disciples divide up 5 loaves and 2 fishes, break them up in baskets, and it turns out at the end of the meal there are 12 baskets full of the barley loaves that are left. It didn't say that they had any fish left over. It wouldn't smell that good. They had to carry that fish around with them for a long time. But the barley loaves, that could be carried around. They could use that for a few days afterward. And that's what they did. But it was that night that he sent his disciples by way of boat, and they sailed and came to Capernaum, where we are. He stayed back, went up into a mountain to pray, and it was at that night that a wind came up. His disciples went ahead. There were no other boats there. He had to get over here, and so it says that he walked across the water. And while they were on their way over, they saw him, thought it was some kind of apparition out there. What's going on? And they realized that it was Yeshua. He was walking on the water. I've tried it several times. I have no idea how he did it. It never's worked for anyone else that I know, but it worked for him. And then it says that when he got in the boat, they were immediately on the other side. They got over here to Capernaum, and then all the people saw that, there were some boats from Tiberias that were there, but the disciples' boat was gone. Yeshua was nowhere around, and so it says that they got in these boats from Tiberias and sailed over to Capernaum. And apparently they knew which way he was heading, the next synagogue on the itinerary. And so they made their way over, and it's very significant what happens when they get over here. And it's also significant what is written here, because it says in chapter 6 of verse 3, Yeshua went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Verse 4, and the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. Then Yeshua lifted up his eyes, saw a great company come unto him, and he told Philip, how are we going to get some bread so that these people can eat? We take a look at the time period right here and what's going on, and these words, and the Passover, the feast of the Jews was nigh, does not make any sense. When we read it, something's wrong here, because first of all, he never goes up to Jerusalem. He stays up here. He teaches in the synagogue, but he never goes up to Jerusalem. Now we know the Torah commands that you go up 3 times a year in Passover. All the men must go up to Jerusalem. But yet, he and thousands of people are not going up. It doesn't add up. When we read what happens here, we see nothing that relates to Passover, not a single thing. And so this became something of great concern to me a number of years ago. What is going on here? Look at the Greek, and it clearly says that Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. But, the Greek text that we have, such as the Textus Receptus, from which the King James version was translated, it is a compiled Greek text. It was Dr. Stevens who, after analyzing with his team hundreds and thousands of fragments of text, and that's all we have today, are just fragments of copies. There are no originals. There's no original, John, the book of John in Greek. All there are fragments, pieces. And so what they did is comparing these thousands of different manuscripts, which many of them differ in many ways. Then they compiled and wrote a text out of what they felt was the best evidence indicated that these should be the texts that are used. And that is the Textus Receptus. Dr. Alsford did the same thing. The Alsford text is good. He compiled the different Greek texts into what he felt and his team felt was the best text. Tregelles, Dr. Tregelles did the same thing. Tischendorf, all these very good, outstanding texts that have been used, that are available out there, and each one of them would make these tests to see what is the best thing. How does it fit? Well, I get concerned when I see things that don't fit, especially when we're speaking of the feast. Because that is the one thing that, for the most part, the Gentile world, growing up in ignorance of, if they don't know about it, then they really don't know what they're reading and how to put things together. And it turns out, without an understanding of the feast of the Lord, you can never fit the gospel record together. It just doesn't fit. And this is one of these places that in my study on this, I found that there are 2 ancient manuscripts, 2 of the oldest ancient manuscripts, number 472 and 850. And all these old text manuscripts, fragments, are all numbered. They're all documented, cataloged, microfilmed. And those 2 texts read like this. We start with verse 3. And Yeshua went up into a mountain, and there sat with his disciples. When Yeshua therefore lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him. What was missing there?
The whole thing about Passover.
Every single word of verse 4. So in these ancient texts, that verse is not even there. Those words are not even there. It just goes from the last word of one to the next word. So what is going on here? It would appear, first of all, that these words were added to try to explain where we are and what's going on here. But what's added here, that Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh, it doesn't make any sense. And now you're going to see what does make sense and why this all adds up. Because after he feeds these 5,000 plus and comes over here to Capernaum, then he speaks a lot of things that is recorded in the 6th chapter, but we really miss the point until we get all the way to verse 59, where it says, "These things said he in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum." So he came over here and taught in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and these are the things that he taught. Now, we're not going to go into all the details here, but we had been working at the time that I was working on this. We had been putting together the ancient biblical calendar for some time. And when I say the ancient calendar, that means what we were doing is going back by the astronomical detail that has been checked out, that NASA has used for a number of years. And with computer programs, we go back to these very years and we catalog them. And to do this is kind of a miracle that happened. I went up to Two Harbors, Minnesota. I had been going up there every once in a while for a year or so, and there was this place that it was like on my heart. As I walked by it, I pray for this place. It was the old Two Harbors Theater. And this time when I went up there, it was empty. So we went over to the city hall. We found out who owned it. It was a gentleman down in Minneapolis. Finally, I got a hold of him. I called him. I went down to Minneapolis and was able to finally find his number there. I called him up, and I said, "I would like to understand that you own the old Two Harbors Theater." And he said, "I do." I said, "I'd like to rent it." And he said, "Well, it's available." And I said, the only problem is I don't have any money." And he said, "Well, what do you mean you don't have any money?" I said, "I have no money." And he said, "Well, what do you want the place for?" So I began describing why I wanted the place, and he said, "Well, this is rather amazing because I bought it and set it up to be a place where my daughter and her husband it was set up as a ministry headquarters for them, but after I renovated it, everything fell through and they've never used it." And he said, "Can you afford $1 for a year?" I said, "I think I can come up with $1. And he said, "Okay, the place is yours for a year for $1. In that theater, from the back place, all the chairs were gone. From the back to the front, I had 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper with the particular calendar month on it. And it went up one aisle and back down the other, up another aisle, back down. The entire theater was filled with these rows of calendars. And I would be on the phone every night, sometimes for hours, with Bob Wadsworth, as we're poring over the details of this ancient calendar, putting together the calculations for the first sliver of the new moon as seen from Jerusalem at that point in time. We had to approximate the Aviv barley, because we can't go back in time and determine when the Aviv barley was, but we used other calculations to help us guesstimate. And we made good guesstimations on these things, I believe. And it was at that time that we were working out the details on it and saw that this very incident appeared to take place at the sighting of the new moon of Tishri, which is the 7th month, the Day of Trumpets. Now, when we got into this situation, then the biblical records started to all add up on this, and I want to take you into some of the things that he taught here while he was at the synagogue. Recall that he is going to fulfill the spring feast of the Lord. And in the fulfillment of the spring feast, this is a covert mission. In fact, Shaul, this learned Torah genius, said that if Satan would have known God's plan of redemption, he never would have crucified the Lord of glory. That's why it was a covert mission. Whenever a demon cried out, "I know who you are, you're the Messiah, you're the son of David," he said, "Shut up and come out of him," would not allow it to be said. As we spoke when we were up on the Golan Heights, just 2 weeks before his crucifixion, he still didn't allow any of his disciples to tell anyone that he was the Mashiach. It was a covert mission. This whole thing is covert. This whole God's plan, so much of it is, what is going on? It was a covert mission. There were some that were supposed to believe, certainly. But he didn't allow anyone to cry it out. But now, when we come to the fall feast, he knows the temple is going to be destroyed. He knows that all the rehearsals that we've been doing for 1,000 years are going to cease when the temple's destroyed. And so now he is going to, at each one of these feasts, he is going to detail and give us more detail about that fall feast. And this appeared to come at that time, and especially when we see the rest of the text. So I'm going to read verse 39. "And this is the Father's will, which has sent me, that of all that he has given me, I should lose nothing, but should raise it up again at the last day." And verse 40, it says, "And this is the will of him that sent me, that everyone which seeth the Son and believes on him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up on the last day." Verse 44, "No man can come unto me except the Father draw him which sent me. And I will raise him up on the last day." Verse 54, again, he says, "I will raise him up on the last day." Does anyone see a pattern in here? What he is talking about is the resurrection and the last day. And if you were to ask any observant Jewish man or woman what the Feast of Trumpets is about, it is about the resurrection. That's just understood. This is the resurrection. The Feast of Trumpets, it's the every year the feast that occurs on a day and hour that no man knows. Last night we were up on the Golan Heights. We sighted the new moon. If that were the feast, if that were the beginning of the 7th month, that moment we sighted the new moon. And of course, in the rehearsal, it would have had to have been reported up at Jerusalem. They would have lit the signal fires, would have been seen from mountaintop to mountaintop, including up on the heights, just overlooking the Galilee here. And that would be the announcement. It would be a high Sabbath. Now, what takes place at this time? This is a Sabbath, and it is also a rehearsal of the resurrection in the last day. That is exactly what he is teaching at the synagogue of Capernaum, because he is giving the details about the fulfillment of the fall feast. Now, when he gets through teaching, it says that chapter 7, verse 2, "Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand." Now, what does that tell us? Chapter 6, he's given the detail on these things about the Day of Trumpets, all concerning Yom Teruah, and now the very next thing that happens is the Feast of Tabernacles. Now it makes sense. If this were, as the King James reads, if it were the Feast of Passover, first of all, Yeshua violated the Torah. He didn't go up. He's staying up in Capernaum, which would be empty because everyone would be up to the feast. And he's teaching something that has nothing to do with Passover and has everything to do with the Day of Trumpets. The Day of Trumpets is 15 days before the Feast of Sukkot. It all makes sense, this being the Feast of Trumpets. And if there's an understanding of this being a feast, then for them, the Greeks to say a feast of the Jews was nigh, which is called Passover. Well, I don't think they did that. I think it was added in by, again, those who didn't know what the feast was, what was really taking place, because it clearly can't be the Feast of Passover. At least in my mind. And seeing how we have some of the most ancient Greek texts in the world that don't even have these words on it, then I'm inclined to think that the scriptures make sense with this being the Day of Trumpets and the Sabbath at that time of the Day of Trumpets, speaking in the synagogue, and then we have the Feast of Tabernacles. And it's at the Feast of Tabernacles that he sent his disciples ahead. He said, you gone up to the feast, I'm not going up yet because my time has not yet come. What he's talking about, well, right at the beginning of the chapter, it says that he would not walk among the religious Jews, the Pharisees, back at Jerusalem because they wanted to kill him. So now it's time to go up to the feast. His disciples say, let's go on up to the feast. Let everyone see the wonderful works that you're doing. He said, my time hasn't come. You go ahead. You go up to the feast. He sent his disciples on ahead. He still has a handful, but we're talking about this time at the end of the summer. We have the 70 that have been sent out. He's got a lot of disciples. Many times we just think of a dozen. But that's not true. We've got a dozen here. We've got 70 that are sent out that do miracles. We've got hundreds and thousands that are following him at this time. And so most of the disciples, most of the people from this area would evacuate this area. And this is the protection of the Almighty. Can you imagine just evacuating this area? All the families just going on up to Jerusalem during the feast? Who's going to be back here to protect everything? Well, the angel of Yahweh seemed to have done a fine job of it for a long time. I think that the only time that he quit doing his job is when we kept keeping the feast. And so everyone went up. He stayed behind with just a few of his disciples. And it was then that we see the situation that's spoken of in Luke. Right after the Feast of Trumpets, he speaks, he teaches for a little bit, and then James and John and Peter, I believe, are the ones that are with him. And we come to what's called the Mount of Transfiguration. And really, what we should call it is the Day of Atonement. Because you don't go up to the Day of Atonement. You go up to the feast. You don't have to go up to the Day of Atonement. It's one day. It's right in the middle or right at the tail end of the harvest. And when the Day of Atonement happens, which is on the 10th day of Tishri, 10th day of the 7th month, then we've got just a few days to get up to Jerusalem at that point. They wanted to kill him at Jerusalem, and the disciples know that. That's why he said, you go ahead. All you, thousands, go on up ahead. I'm staying behind. And so he's out in a deserted place, and that's when Peter, James, and John were with him, and he saw this supernatural manifestation. They saw, it says, a vision of Yeshua with Moses and Elijah, and he was transformed before them. As they looked at this and saw this, when they then spoke to him afterwards, they said, Lord, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let's stay here. We'll build 3 sukkahs here. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Because they know that they want to kill him up at Jerusalem. Okay, here's an idea. Let's not go up to Jerusalem. Let's stay here. Obviously, this is a very blessed place. Sounds like a good idea. Until a voice comes out of heaven, and it says, this is my beloved Son. Listen to him. You guys have some really goofy ideas. and they leave, and they go up to Jerusalem for the feast. On their way up, they stop near the village of the Samaritans, where he taught just after Shavuot. They sent Andrew, James and John, I believe, James and John in to buy provisions. We talked about that the other day, where they refused to even sell him anything. No pita, no hummus, no Reuben sandwiches. Wouldn't sell him a thing because he was not going to play religion with them and stay at Mount Gerizim for the feast. He was going up to Jerusalem. And then he continues on his way up. This is the place where it happened, in the village of Capernaum, where he taught on the last great day, the last day, and the resurrection, and related it to the Day of Trumpets, which is the feast that occurs on a day and hour that no man knows.
As we close this particular teaching, Yeshua is on his way up from the Galilee to Jerusalem. He will stop off at a Samaritan village on his way for a very interesting altercation. In our next episode in the A Rood Awakening series, I will take you back in time to that earlier encounter between Yeshua and the community of Samaritans who worshiped on Mount Gerizim. We will watch the entire prophetic story unfold in The Woman at the Well. This is Michael Rood from Jerusalem bidding you shalom, peace, and I'll see you when the smoke clears.